This is PPD. You guys are watching Thorin's YouTube channel. One of the only men with a bigger ego than even myself.
Right, this is going to be another episode of my donator discussion for people who are $100 or more donators on Patreon. We've got a pretty packed house for this one. Some people who have been in most of the recent ones, so you'll hear some familiar voices. But as is tradition, we actually do have one individual who's never been on this episode before, this particular format, which is going to be Eddie. So here's what we usually do, Eddie. Like, first of all, give us like a basic flavour as to like what esports games do you follow. Therefore, we can maybe guess, you know, what references to give, what you might want to talk about in this episode. And then ideally, if you maybe have a first topic or something that you bring into the table you'd like to start a discussion about, mate.
Sure, right on. My name's Eddie. I've been playing League since about 2010, and I've been following the esports side of it since around 2014 with your content with Monty. I've also recently been picking up Counter-Strike in the past 2 years, and with that, some Valorant just here and there, but primarily League of Legends.
Fair enough. Okay. I will say, even though in theory, obviously the main two games that my audience follows is League of Legends and CSGO, I will say generally, it feels to me like it's more people who come from League who overlap a little bit in the CSGO. A lot of my people from CSGO don't really follow League of Legends. You can understand it's a very different game. So I will say this podcast does tend to be pretty dominated by Counter-Strike talk, which is fine. It's for the people who are on the show to decide the topics. But maybe you have a League-related topic you want to start us with, Eddie? Do you have something that's burning at the moment or anything interesting that you want to talk about?
Sure. There was a video a while back where you were talking about a particular basketball player who had to relearn the fundamentals of shooting. And
yeah, it was Steph Curry, actually.
Steph Curry, yeah, exactly. So Steph Curry, you know, historically, he was somebody that had to redevelop his fundamentals, but that in time, he became one of the best shooters in the league.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, in your opinion, is there any Western player that stands out that could use a, you know, re-understanding of the fundamentals that might become an all-time great, like the Eastern players, like a Faker or like a
right,
you know, somebody in that regard?
Right. Yeah, basically the premise for people who don't know this is one of the reasons why I always give sports analogies. So what I try to do with my analogies is I try to give a mixture of either a real specific sports example so that if someone knows that sport, they might get more understanding, or I give an abstract. And the problem is both of them can confuse people. Like people who've never had any sort of meta thinking, actually they'd probably be better off with specific examples. So if people don't know, you probably know, even if you don't follow the NBA, who Steph Curry is. He's probably the best three-point shooter of all time. And he basically changed basketball because just from his individual game, he was so accurate shooting all forms of three-pointers, including the ones that were supposed to be the lowest field goal percentage, which is when you guarded essentially and off the dribble. He was basically hitting like 40% or more accuracy, an incredible rate, so that as a result, he was able to individually scale up how many he took per game. And in doing so, effectively, all the other NBA teams figured out you don't even have to have Steph Curry. If you just have someone who's a good three-pointer shooter and you set the shot up for them, you can scale the entire teams up. And now all teams basically are three-point shooting teams in the NBA. Well, the reason why that's significant is you would maybe naively think, because this guy's the best shooter of all time, that actually he's just one of those guys who came out of the womb just as the best. But the interesting detail is, because his dad was a very good three-point shooter, but in the era where you just took like a set shot and he wasn't like sort of moving the ball up, his dad actually helped him rebuild his shot, like his motion of his shooting form. And a lot of people now would say he has almost like the dream shooting form now. He's extremely quick, like single motion shot. But apparently he didn't have that. And basically he just had like a good shot, but like whatever his fucked up natural form was. And when his dad helped him retool his game, I think it was between high school and college, it supposedly actually sort of tanked his game for the first year or so. And people thought he was shit. But in the long run, it meant that he did eventually have almost the perfect mechanics combined with skill, and it basically made him the best ever. So it's a pretty interesting abstract concept, because obviously, I mean, we could even expand this out. If some of you don't follow League of Legends, feel free to pick a CSGO player who you think this would be like. But basically the question he's asking is that, like, if someone changed their like approach to the game or their perspective on the game or concepts of the fundamentals, like who could be a way better player? And I'm already in League of Legends, I'm thinking of quite a few players, because one of the things about League of Legends I always think, which is on the one hand makes sense, but also is a massive limiting factor, is you'll probably notice that a lot of, because coaches typically don't know how to develop players, they tend to just like label players, and then they just, in their mind, how they model the game is, they just put one piece in a different place. So, for example, the obvious example, Eddie, would be like a player who's not known for playing top lane carries, but is decent on bruisers and is good on tanks. Like, they will just become a perma weak side player whose job is just teleport when you're told to, or just waiting to be a tank in a fight and peel for the AD carry or something, you know, like that's obviously like a classic example. So the question would be like, if we could take one of these players, hopefully someone with some skills and some potential, but we could sort of make them revisit how they see the game, who could get a lot better. And I actually think there are tons of players in League of Legends. I think actually it would be the most apt game for that approach, because there are so many players who have like self-limiting beliefs in the game. Like, I've always found it incredible, the extremes, like when you see people like, if you know the European player Leader, who typically only tends to play like sort of like AD and off-meta champions in mid lane. He doesn't play the control mages. Like, that to me is mind-blowing, because even though I understand why his strength would always be those champions, because he's basically like a very mechanically skilled player, the idea he doesn't play the other ones, it's like, that can't be. Like, that has to be something about his mindset, is not even... Basically, what he's doing is he's just saying, I'm never going to actually commit mentally to the idea I have to develop that part of my game because I don't think it's as good, which doesn't really make sense, because if you were to define certain roles in League of Legends, like, you're going to have a hard life as a pro if you can't ever play a tank as a top laner. You're going to have a hard life as a mid laner if you can't play a mage. You're going to have a very hard life as an AD carry player if you don't play a character that's just good at hitting auto attacks and just does loads of basic auto attack. Like, these are the basic concepts for those roles that will probably always cripple your career if you can't do that. Even if, I'm not saying be the best at that, you just have to be able to do that. So I think that's an obvious example. Do you have someone who was coming to mind when you came up with the question?
Not particularly. I just wanted to hear you expand on it and see if there's anybody that came to your mind, since you're very, you're pretty deep within the scene.
Yeah, sure.
Also, with my recent interest in Counter-Strike, I've been applying some of those things to myself to try and get better, so, I'm not shit on the server. And it seems like a lot of the people in Counter-Strike play on 400 to 800 DPI. And, it seems like a lot of Counter-Strike, you can really break down the mechanics of that game as well and really restructure, relearn fundamentals with use of like the workshop or use of demos. It seems like Counter-Strike as a whole has a lot more utility to make that a, like, how would you say? Maybe
like tools to work on your game or something.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Where it seems like something I've noticed, at least with my interest in Valorant 2, is that there's not a lot of tools out there. So a lot of times people are still playing Counter-Strike, even though they play Valorant, to go on workshop maps or using aim lab and things of that nature. And I was just wondering...
Oh, is that why? I never actually put that together, mate. I always wondered why Valorant and Overwatch pros are always posting the fucking aim lab things. I always used to think, why not just play in the game? But I guess I hadn't thought of that. Like, in Valorant, do they not have, like, DM servers and stuff? Do they not have this stuff?
There's matchmaking deathmatch, which is 14-player on maps that were meant for 10. The spawns are kind of shit.
So there's too many people spawn and shoot you inside the head constantly.
It's like Valve DM, yeah. It's basically the same thing.
It's basically that, yeah. And it's really hard to, like, do the set goals and, because it's a bit of a mess. It's chaotic for sure.
Fair enough.
And they've also just come out and said they're never adding map support or anything like that.
Oh, right.
Never going to allow you to make a custom map. So that they basically killed that whole idea. Anyway, any tool has to be official, basically.
It's amazing, and I love that company. You just can't beat certain philosophy, can you?
Yeah. Well, remember, sandbox mode would lead to toxicity or whatever what they said.
That's what they actually did say back in the league. Yeah, you're right. Before they eventually just did it anyway. Yeah. Does anyone else have one? I know some of you follow league.
So Rocket doesn't want other people to make community maps.
No, you're not allowed to, as far as I know.
But they made such a big deal of getting Volcano as a game developer.
Oh no, don't get me wrong. Like, that's just Riot in a nutshell there, mate. Like, I mean, yeah, to me, the whole point of hiring someone like that is the idea that you should... Let's face it, logically, Valorant the game wouldn't exist without fucking community maps in CSGO. Like, use your fucking brain, but they're not the sort of people who do that, unfortunately, mate. I mean, I would even say this, not that Riot would ever understand. There wouldn't even be a League of Legends if we didn't have modding, you dumb fox. Like, someone modded Warcraft 3 with a map, and that became League of Legends, the game you play, via Dota. So, like, none of these people will ever get it. Like, it's why, actually, that whole discussion of, like, how you make a new esport it doesn't, you don't get anywhere because you never find the answer. But what you actually find out is how little we all know. Like, you eventually find out none of these games were really designed, and it was just a mixture of luck, and I would call it like survivorship bias. You know, like you just got through some sort of fucked up, like natural selective process, but you don't know why. You just happen to be the one who survived, and the other guy died out, you know. But there's not necessarily like a reason that we can identify. Going back to the original point, though, does anyone have any on Eddie's angle here? Like I said, we could do it for CSGO as well if you want. It's the idea, basically, I mean, I'll give you an example actually that was spurred from a conversation I had today where I was talking to Blade on my other show, Stratbook, which is a player I've often mentioned. I actually think has been criminally underused because he himself doesn't have the mentality to match his skill set. So everyone probably knows in CSGO there's tons of players who think they're the shit individually, who are just like average players. A lot of Americans, for example, you know, they just have a delusional perspective on how good they individually are. What you might not know is there's players who have the opposite. And a player, I'll tell you right now, it's depressing, but it's Flamey from Na'Vi. Like, if you ever actually talked to this guy, or even if you just watch him in POV demos, like the way he moves in the game, this is like a guy who's, I would say, like racked with insecurity, and he's a guy who doesn't actually feel very confident about his game. He doesn't think, by the way, that he has like nut skills. Meanwhile, if you ever watch Flamey when he's like on form, that guy has really good mechanical skill. Like, if I was him, like, mate, I don't need simple skills. I'll take Flamey's skills. I'll be one of the best in the world. Like, he just has a mentality, though, where he doesn't think of himself as that type of player. And as a result, like, I think it's always held him back in the game. Does anyone have any good League or CSGO-related examples you were thinking of while we were laying this out?
I mean, for me, the most... Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, so most obvious for me is Hillestad from Fnatic. He's probably like the best Rakan in the world, and he has a couple more heroes, but the rest of them, I mean, he's usually average. So I think that could really make him really, really good. The other one is Rakan.
No, that's a good shout, by the way. Let's do that one first. Let's go one at a time. I think Hillestad's actually a great shout because I also personally always thought that like Hillestad's biggest problem. You actually see this sometimes with the really abusive and exploitative top laners. You can tell that it's a philosophy thing, not the champion they play, because they'll play that way even when they're on the fucking tank. And you're like, brother, you're playing that like you're playing Camille. So the example where Hillestad is, obviously, yeah, if you put him on Rakan, Pyke, Thresh, like these champions, he's going to be a fucking stud. And he might even make some like game-winning play that like an Asian team would get broken by. The other problem is, though, you put him on champions that are nothing like that, and he'll still go for the same players, and he'll still try and make some crazy outplay, even on champions that actually can't even really outplay. So, like, I even think that's a pretty good example because to me, he's someone where it's like what you needed to tell him was be the player you are now on those champions, but on these other ones, you got to play differently. You have to have like two modes. And then the other one you were going to say is obviously like his former bot lane partner in Reckless, right?
Yeah.
Same thing with him, but the opposite, basically. It's why actually they made a very good bot lane, didn't they? Like, they sort of covered each other's weaknesses and their strengths combined. Because, yeah, same thing with Reckless. Like, here's what people don't know about Reckless. There's two ways it could have gone in his career. One is just do what you're doing now, and generally, as long as your solos are really sick, there's still going to be enough you could potentially be the best. The other is, like I said about the Hillestad one, but flipped. What Reckless needs to do is something actually, I'll relate this to CSGO for some that you don't follow that league. In CSGO, I hate in-game leaders who are good tactical in-game leaders who never allow for anything except their tactical system. So obvious examples would be Blade, MSL, back in the day, if you know 1.6, my mate Lurpis. And what I always used to say to Lurpis back in the day is, look, have your whole tactical system, but there are certain teams and specifically certain matches where it's just not working, mate. Like the tempo you play at isn't working, your star players having an off game, so that particular tactic doesn't work now, or this position's compromised. I said in those moments, you've got to have like basically like, think of it like one of those scenarios where someone smashes like a red box on the wall when in case of emergency and pulls out something for a fire or, you know, an emergency like a beacon or something. You have to have something like that, and it's basically called like fuck it mode. And when you press that button, you tell everyone basically, right, you just play free fall. Like, you just rush, just go and do whatever you need, cause chaos. That you have to have a button that sort of totally changes your style so that you don't just become predictable. Like, I always thought Reckless needed one of those, basically. And if I were him, if you watch his career, it's even obvious when you'd say it. Just every time you're in an elimination game, mate, or a game where it looks like your team's going to gradually lose, you have to just know what moment in the game to press that button. Because I think, for me, all the great players who were carries, they all have that button. Because eventually, Simple and Na'Vi is probably the best example of this currently, if you know CSGO. Eventually, you're going to be in a scenario where you're the best player. You can see the rounds playing out, so you're probably going to lose the round. Right? What do you do then? Do you just let them choke you out slowly, or do you just say, right, I'm going to take a stand now and I'm going to break the system for a moment to win the game? In my opinion, the great players do the latter. That's the reason why they're the greatest players.
Yeah, and even the threat then becomes, okay, he might do this. Whereas Reckless, you pretty much know he's never going to do it, so you can play around that.
Yeah, what people wouldn't understand who are obviously just like blind Reckless fans is nobody's scared of playing against Reckless. Like, if you play against Reckless, what you do is you ask yourself this: how good is his team? If his team can't ever get enabled, I'm not scared at all of playing him. He's just going to safely farm in lane, come to the team fight, and if we miss position, he might kill a couple of us. That's it. I'm not scared he's going to break the whole game like Uzi I or someone. Because, yeah, I agree. The big problem is this. If you don't ever test the limits, the top players will realise that. And in knowing that you won't test certain limits, it actually creates pockets and moments on the map where they know that you're no threat to them. You won't kill them, you won't attack them, you won't inhabit space that's open. And basically, like, that won't immediately mean they can all beat you, but it opens the door to them beating you in a way that, like, if you at least, as we say here, had at least the threat that you might do the opposite style, they have to at least question if they're going to try and exploit it, etc. Someone else have some angle on this, or another play you want to bring up?
Yeah. So I kind of feel bad about it, but the first person that came to mind when thinking about breaking down something fundamental or mechanic in their game and rebuilding it, I was thinking about how much better Pasha would have been if somebody kneecapped him in game, so he had to relearn how to walk. And I
even though you're half joking, like, that is actually a real point, by the way. So, yeah, that's a serious point for sure, yeah.
Bot OP maneuver better in certain situations.
Actually, I don't know if you know this.
That has this as a famous bit or something that I could look up, because I haven't actually seen Pasha, like...
No, it's just basically he was, like, infamous for having really bad movement. Like, he's one of those people where my joke is it looks like he's playing Quake when he's playing, like, Counter-Strike. As in Quake, you have, like, an inertia when you move, you know? You don't instantly stop, like, whereas in Counter-Strike, you sort of stop pretty quickly. Pasha always looked like he was just sort of, like, floating around the map really slow. Like, it looked like his character model didn't run full speed, literally. And it looked like he couldn't sort of, like, harsh navigate angles. He had to sort of drift in that direction. Now, what's funny about that is, by the way, a very, very bizarre detail is you might think to yourself, how did the guy ever play as a pro player? Like, wouldn't every pro exploit this? Well, an interesting detail, you can go look this up. If you go and watch my Reflections interview with Fallen literally says that Pasha was the hardest player to play against in terms of AWPers for this reason, because basically what would happen is Pasha's movement would be so bad that when he was about to peek out in an AWP duel, you would see the gun barrel, because of how huge the AWP model is, like super early, right? So the scenario is it's like the Pinocchio game. You see the nose peeking out. So then what would happen is you think, right, fuck, he's coming out any second, so you get ready to pre-fire him, right? But because his movement isn't like other players, you would always miss. So even though he's actually moving like in a really like inefficient manner, the fact that no one else moves the way he did means you would actually miss your AWP shot, and then he might just kill you with a basic AWP shot. So you'll feel really stupid because you'll feel like, what the fuck? He's not even doing that right. But that's just one of those things where like that's why actually doing things that are counter to the meta can be effective as well, precisely because the meta is not to play that way. But I agree with you, mate. Like basically, what he reminds me of, the best sports analogy would be, I don't know how many people are going to know this reference, but it's actually shocking if you know it. In NBA history, one of the best players ever, ask anyone for their top 10, top 20 players, and everyone in their top 20, maybe top 10, is going to have Shaquille O'Neal, right? One of the most dominant players of all time. But he was, like many centers, his position, absurdly bad at free throws. Like, he was just garbage. And as a result, it actually basically cuts away his main strength, because you're no longer as scared of him having the ball down low, because you know if you foul him, he just doesn't make both the free throws. So actually, you can limit his scoring. Now, what people might not know is because a free throw is a shot where you aren't guarded, you just stood at the line throwing the ball. There's a million ways you can break down your form to do free throws. And one of the most famous, one of the best free throw shooters in the history of the NBA was a person called Rick Barry from the 60s and 70s. And what he did is, he was already an amazing shooter, three-point and free throw. And so he actually figured out what is the most consistent form to shoot a free throw. And believe it or not, he discovered that it was to shoot it underhanded. You take the ball with both hands under the ball, not over like they all do in the NBA, and you basically throw it up, because when you throw it up like this, this. Basically, it's what you would expect like an old person to do who doesn't have very much mobility. The reason it's the best shot is because it makes the best arc on the ball, and basically the arc on the ball is what decides how many possible like slightly off angle shots will still go in the basket. It's why if you shoot like a straight shot that has very little arc, it can only sort of go in like one angle basically. Whereas like Steph Curry, who we were talking about earlier with the 3-point shot, he has like an incredible like rainbow arc, so that if it just comes anywhere near, it's almost certainly going to go in. So basically, this guy told Shaquille O'Neal, I'll literally train you how to shoot free throws like this, and you could maybe add like 10% to your free throw percentage. And Shaquille O'Neal straight up told him, something stupid like, I would rather miss the free throws than sort of look like a pansy by throwing him that way. That's effectively what this guy told him. Now, that is mental, because if you already are one of the best players of all time, and someone's telling you, I can increase how many shots you make that are free shots unguarded, you're just basically telling that guy, like, yeah, I'd rather not win as many games as I could, though. So... yeah. There are people like that, believe it or not. So, like, Pasha's a great example of that. Like, definitely basics like movement could be taught. It's just that, unfortunately, like, Pasha didn't play in the era when anyone who was in a coaching position would even vaguely think of doing something like that. And, unfortunately, in Counter-Strike, like the example I gave of Steph Curry, he had to take, like, a whole year, and he actually did it a month when it was dangerous for his career. It's one of the reasons, as far as I know, he wasn't, like, super highly touted coming to the NBA. So... the other problem in Counter-Strike is, I don't know if you can get like 6 months or a year off to really go hard at this sort of shit. Yeah, like most people, you need results this month. Like, I know that's one of the reasons why, for example, I believe when Rez had like some sort of RSI injury, he changed his mousing position. I didn't go and check the stats, but I wouldn't be surprised if he, went off the boil for 3 months and then became good again, So that's another reason why it's not simple to do that, unfortunately. Does anyone have another name on this one, or are we going to move the conversation along? What are we doing?
I got one from another angle where actually it's less about the player having developed a system or developed some sort of bad habit that they have to work out. It's more like almost by force in a way, like by circumstance, they've had to completely change up their roles. And I kind of have a what if in my head of what they would do instead. And it's automatic from the fact that he obviously had to go main op for a while. Or felt that he had to go main op back when he was in the really troubled times with like that ridiculously like
the international lineup, right? Yeah,
roster, yeah. And from that point onward, he never really went back to main rifle, and eventually moved on over to Valorant. And there's a lot of what ifs around his career in general. He obviously is kind of a journeyman in that respect, where he's been in a lot of different teams. But for me, I feel like there was a shot for him to really cement his legacy as a player without needing to rely on the fluke win of a major, right? Like, you could have just said he's like top 5 NA player. I feel like if he had really stayed the course with the rifle and found a way onto maybe a stable roster, and neither of those things ended up happening for him, unfortunately. So he ended up moving over and switching games entirely. But that's a player that I do feel like, what if somebody had sort of said, hey, I see you're pivoting to op. How about not doing that? And he had taken that advice. It's almost I guess it's a different angle than what we were initially talking about. But that's what comes to mind when I hear this kind of conversation, is sort of what if for his career.
Put it this way, of the players that won the major with Cloud9, if you froze time at that moment and said, pick one of the 5 who actually becomes like a truly great player and goes down, he would be the obvious one you would pick. Yeah. Like, so obviously Skadoodle was already washed at that point in time, so he can't go back in time. Tarek was always sort of like a good player, but never like a superstar, and obviously actually transitioned into supportive roles. Rush was actually at the time a bit washed. His game was a bit off. Stewie, I don't think was in the best place. That's it. That's everyone. So to me, Automatic was the one who, his skills, like the eye test showed you, they were obviously always very good. The very fact that you are playing different roles to sort of pick up the slack, in a way, it shows that you have a better skill set. It's just, unfortunately, I think like him, once people get in the habit of doing that, oftentimes they don't get out of that trap, unfortunately. Like they then feel as though they're being a bad teammate if they try and be selfish, But put it this way, he's also the player where, I'm sure people know about that. Originally, it was going to be him instead of Tarek that could have gone to MIBR with Stewie 2K. But also, as far as I know, he was one of the players that Europeans in teams like FaZe actually did consider good. Like, they would potentially have considered him for an international lineup. So, yeah, he's someone where actually, considering he won a decent amount of championships and was in some pretty good teams, probably actually is on the low end of what he could have accomplished in his career. I actually feel like if he'd been more ruthless in terms of like mindset, and as we're saying here, be more selfish in terms of demanding like what you need to be the best in your individual game, probably could have been a much greater player. Yeah, I'm with you on that one.
Yeah. And I guess one of the other, like the follow-up point is really about the fact that it's kind of like when people get, they excel at a certain field and they get a promotion in a company, and eventually they hit a wall where they are actually underqualified for a position, but they were overqualified for the previous one. And I don't think he was necessarily like underqualified to main op, but I don't think that was the best use of his skill set. Like he could have done something better in another department if we were using that analogy. And it kind of felt like a very similar to that with me, where the role selection was confused on his teams in general, not just for him, but it was almost a downstream consequence.
Automatic is easily the player I least expected to end up kind of fizzling out and going to Valorant. Because like from the inception of him, people starting to talk about him going to C9. Like I had been watching him on TSM. He wasn't a super, like he didn't show up on the stats too much, but he consistently made good decisions. And that did Cloud9 so much good. And it would do any NA team today so much good. And it sucks to see him gone.
Do we have another topic to move over to?
I have a related one, which is the fact that with League changing so much this year, and I guess the thing in CS is that it's online. A couple of teams didn't really try hard that much, and the obvious one is G2. And the other one I had in mind was T1, but in a different way, where they were just swapping players all along. Do you think this is fine because it's spring, or they just screw up a major chance of going to MSI and so on? And for me, the biggest one is G2 because and Wonder in specific, because the items changed so much, which means the whole game changed a lot. So your entire history is now not that relevant when you can get the Udyr or Hecarim running at you at 1,000 MS. So you kind of have to relearn the game. And if you don't play together, if you don't play solo queue, you're not relearning that game. So any thoughts? I think this is fine. This is spring. They'll get it back in the summer. This was just a practice split for them.
I do think it's convenient that the two teams who ended up in the final in Europe were basically teams of what, to me, effectively are still rookies. And as a result, in theory, you're going to be very open to the coaching staff and how they want to change the way you play the game. Because as you say, to me, this was almost a hard reset of how the game itself is played. It has definitely changed over the last few years just because of the items and all the different champions we're using now. I actually think if you look at G2 this spring, this just shows you how good the lineup with perks actually was. Because think about it, with the exception of the first split they played together when they had the perks caps lineup, they always still had to come back from the brink. They lost a series, or they would go to 5 games, or they would have crazy games where they have to climb back into a game when it looks like it's lost. So if they were doing that with arguably the best lineup to ever play in Europe, they already were sort of risking it each time they played and just barely surviving. And to me, that's probably one of the weirdest things. You look at how many championships they had and how good they were internationally. They weren't actually like the great League of Legends teams in history. They weren't a team that just smashed the whole split and no one can stand against them. They weren't really like that, actually, beyond the first time they played together. They always were sort of phoning it in the regular split, but still winning the odd game to show the potential power level. Then in the playoffs, it's somehow they would just peak at it. It's basically they would produce their best game at the moment when if you don't, you're eliminated. And then they would come back and win the split. And then bizarrely, internationally, again, people always ignore this, but this happened every time. Every single time internationally, they would fuck around in the group stage, even though we're at the international level now. Normal teams, you have to beat your best in the group stage. They do the same thing internationally. They'll fuck around the group stage. They'll lose the odd game, sometimes to a random team you never expect. But then they'll play a big series against some of the best teams in the world, and suddenly the best form comes out again. So, the problem with that angle is, think about what the metaphor people always use. It's of a switch, right? It's the idea of you have a switch, you can flip it. And when you flip it, you're just at your best. Very few people in history can actually have a switch. A lot of people talk like they do. Most people just don't have one. Most times, if you're not in great form, you just stay in not great form and you don't do very well. Or if you've been doing bad for the last month, you're not going to turn it around in this next match. So I think in some ways, they probably took that for granted. I think they believed that somehow it was just going to turn around at some point this split and that they'd just be the best again. So I still think the lineup is fire. They have some incredible players, and there's literally no reason. If I'm the coaching staff and the people who run GA, at G2. I just say I've still got the best lineup now. I'll take it just into summer and we'll win summer. But you can't take for granted any of the things the old G2 lineup. In my opinion, you should treat it like a brand new lineup at this point in time. Like, I don't think a lot of what helped them in the past even seems to carry over to this lineup. Any thoughts from anyone?
I still wonder about G2's legacy in general, because it is unfortunately the byproduct of the game changing so radically every patch. And I think, I didn't follow this too closely, but I think this particular season changed apparently the most radically since like maybe in history, or maybe just in recent history, compared to the meta that was around before. And so because Riot's trying to engineer the game into a different direction, maybe in a dramatically different direction in this case, it does feel like we never got a chance to see, and I guess this is also a problem with the tournament formats where you have worlds, and that's basically it. Like MSI and worlds are your key international competitions. It's just one of those cases where I really wanted to see G2 at these high prestige international tournaments when they could really compete. And when they didn't have any issues adapting to the meta. I know that's basically a part of playing League at the professional level now, is just adapting, but it does make me feel like we were almost robbed as spectators of some of the highest hype matches or the most competitive close series to really figure out who the best team actually was in any given day. And, hats off to G2 for making it so deep in Worlds several times, but I don't know how long their players will be able to handle that. And obviously, considering they did lose perks, that's the biggest sort of red flag for me, is like wondering where they're going to go next. That's Ocelot's favorite game. Like, he's the closest to that, so I wouldn't expect him to like put his to release his foot from the pedal, so to speak. I think he's going to keep a very close eye on it. But yeah, the other issue is basically what Zen mentioned, is that this is also a team that is kind of notorious for coasting until playoffs or coasting until summer. So we don't really fully know, and we don't have too many opportunities to see them, as I just mentioned. So it is kind of disappointing we don't see them at MSI, but there's always the next season.
You also have to realize, like, most pro players, it's the reason why I always tell people this slogan. They think I'm saying it just to diss players, but I'm actually trying to just make people get a perspective that, like, a pro player isn't, like, born of some different genetic lineage than you. A pro player who's played at the pro level for 1 year is basically just like a fucking challenger player who just got picked up and maybe has slightly better mechanics or game understanding. That's about it. Like, it's just otherwise a random person who just has some basic skills at the game. Like, there's no correlation between getting the chance at a pro level and having a really deep understanding of all the game and being a professional. Like, that's what you're actually starting to learn if you think about it. It's the same reason why I can always tell, like, a massive red flag for me with anyone in real life is someone who's done a degree and then thinks they're an expert in that subject. It's like, that would be like getting your driving license and thinking you could win Formula 1. You've only got a driving license, mate. You've essentially just shown the most basic competence in the field, and you're now beginning your field. Like, in the same context, if you become a pro player, you've just become one, mate. You aren't one yet. You don't know everything about being a pro. And so, unfortunately, a lot of, like, the mental game of thinking about being a pro, handling the ups and downs, knowing when to peak, that's, like, stuff that you have to master over many, many years. It's not going to come from your coaching staff. And typically, unless you're lucky enough to get a Mythia perks, you're not even going to get it from your teammates. But the reason why I bring this up is because everyone wishes, in a narrative movie sense of, like, what we imagine these players to be like. Everyone wants the great champions in history to be like some Tiger Woods, Roger Federer, Kobe Bryant motherfucker who's like, they kill themselves to win every championship, and they're just trying to stack as many championships as they can so that in the all-time historical books they could be number one, right? I'm sorry to tell you, most pros, even champions, aren't like that in esports. They aren't like that in life. But basically, as a result, it might sound like, come on, nobody really thinks spring doesn't matter. I'll tell you who doesn't think spring matters. People who've won a gang of LEC titles already, who've won MSI already, who've been in world semi-finals a bunch of times, a final one time. Like, I'm sorry, but even though it's getting ahead of themselves, those players are thinking about winning MSI and winning worlds. They're not thinking about winning LEC. So, for example, I don't think that some of the G2 players think this is the end of the world. I think they've taken an ego hit that they didn't at least make the final. That is probably a concern. And they lost to the two underdog teams on paper in terms of like experience. But to me, like, some of them probably do think, as long as we win summer and we go to Worlds, who cares? Like, we've already won a bunch of LEC titles. To me, that's a little bit whack, but I also understand it, because if you know League, the game in general, the way the circuit goes, the paradox is, despite the fact you don't get many, like, separate chances to show yourself internationally, you still get burned out to a crisp no matter what if you're a champion in League of Legends. So unfortunately, with how much you have to play and practice continuously, week after week after week after week, with barely any weeks off, I sort of get why these teams... You saw it with the Fnatic cores in the past with Expeke and Soaz. They just essentially learn how to be the best at coasting. Even the G2 that had Perks and Mithy and Sven, they also would coast and then just turn up and win the championship. Like, it eventually becomes just sort of like almost a necessity, unless you're someone who has an insane work ethic and is really just going to like burn yourself to a crisp. And I would even say, if you burn yourself to a crisp, you're then also sort of saying, yes, I'm going to win these championships in this window, but after this window, I might have nothing left. So I can't even entirely say it's like one is better than the other. It's just, as a general trend, I could easily believe that some of the G2 players, it's not life and death to win LEC Spring. I mean, they did it twice in a row the last few years, if not many more times in their careers.
So what about in CSGO? Because, I mean, that's basically the same rationale that people started at the beginning of the pandemic. Oh, this is online, etc. Sure. Doesn't matter. But, I mean, after a year, it counts, right? Like, something has to count. There's no other majors in this past year. So is Gambit the best team now? Like, does that mean that, the historic ones are not as good as them? Or is it just, okay, this is online. In a year, we'll actually discount this again. And it's okay for teams to not take this 100%.
I mean, what I would say is, think logically. Who is going to value more the big online games than the people who haven't done much offline, or they never had their chance to be at the top? That's like, if you're Gambit Gaming, you're not waiting for Lance to come back. As far as you're concerned, this is Counter-Strike and you're the best. So you're going hard as you can right now. You're not waiting and, like, you're not saving something for the major. You're going ham now and you're seeing if you even get to a major. You can't take anything for granted. Your players were nothing a year ago, a year and a half ago. You weren't even that relevant. Like 9 months ago, you were like barely just coming into relevance, basically. So to me, this entire topic of who will actually be good online and who is good online now and is it totally legit never even becomes about what the topic claims it's about. It's all just mental fucking cope from people who either refuse to acknowledge anyone could have gotten better in the last 2 years. So obviously someone like Gambit could be very good now. Maybe on LAN they'd already be very good. And on the other side, you have the people who just basically believe everyone who's getting an online result now must just be better. Even though, as I've said many times, take out the teams that have like Hercules level demigods in who never play bad, and every team's all over the fucking place with their results. All of them. I mean, if you go and look at Elysia's stats in Team Liquid, if Simple and Zewu don't exist, you can't ask this guy to do more, and even his team has up and down results. So to me, what I don't get about the whole online period is, now that we've run it for long enough, like at this point we're talking like almost, it'd be just about a year now. After a whole year, who's the team who was just top 4 the whole time? Do they exist? No. It was maybe Vitality, right? Even they fell off. Astralis didn't do it most of the time. Na'Vi was up and down, had runs where they were very good, then runs where they were just decent. Like, if anything, if it was possible what a fan wants to believe, right, which is, even though it's online CS, we have to just mentally adapt. And in fact, the team that's the best is the team that will adapt. Okay, so then let me follow this premise through. Tell me who that team is then. Tell you, by the way, it ain't Gambit Gaming. Because that implies that, like, if we run this for another year, Gambit Gaming stays number 1 because they've figured out how to adapt and play online, right? To me, if anything, I think Gambit Gaming will eventually go through what all these dominant teams did, which is they'll have a period where they're the 5th best team and they don't win any events as well, unfortunately. Do you have some more thoughts on this?
Sorry. I feel like people can reference your strip club analogy again. And I feel like the first LAN will be kind of the first gut check. I think Gambit is impressive right now. And I think they're making the best of their situation. But no, they're not the best in the world. I don't think anybody at top 1 for the last year has genuinely been the first in the world.
What does anyone else think? I want some more thoughts on this one.
About the teams being the best in the world during the online era. I think I'll go a little bit further back and talk about your asterisk analogy where you mentioned, it's probably not even really an analogy, but you said there's a massive sort of conditional and a whole lot of diminishing factors about the online era. The fact that the game plays functionally different is something that people have probably just accepted by now, but I haven't heard too many people talk about this. They're probably just tired of having to think about the fact that you can wide swing online in ways that you simply can't do on LAN, unless, just especially not at the highest level of play. There's people talking about this recent Cadian clutch at the EPL Grand Finals. And obviously that kind of clutch never happens on LAN. You're not going to hear all of the same things that you hear when there's a crowd at their feet. You're not going to have the same isolation from just any sort of audio. And you're also going to be playing on LAN where there's going to be very different tactics. And ideally, you're not going to be playing the 5th map in a best of 5 where everybody is exhausted. So a lot of diminishing factors even on that. And that is probably the perfect storm as far as how that event could have ended. And still, it felt a little hollow for me watching that one. And that was just like, what can you realistically do to make this era of online Counter-Strike more entertaining? I think maybe that's why, to some extent, that same thing has had a knock-on effect on the teams, especially the teams that remember, to your point about G2, right? Over in League, there's a memory of greatness that these people have, the memory of playing at LAN at the highest level of competition for the largest stakes possible. It's a lot harder to get in the zone, I would imagine, if you're dealing with an online circumstance where you can't handle everything the same way.
What was the last thing you were saying, Pronogo?
I was just talking about how the memories of greatness are maybe blocking the people who are more experienced at LAN. I was going to segue it into a point about Gambit essentially being born in the online era. And why that is probably going to bite them in the ass when we do return to LANs, but for now it's serving them pretty well.
But it is weird. The Gambit example for me is, forget online, offline. It's even like, actually, this happens in League of Legends a lot, where obviously like what characters are strong and what the meta is will depend how good you are. You get this happen all the time in League of Legends, where what happens is, for this particular split, some new player is straight fire. Like, oh, fucking hell, they tear up the league. It's so many fucking junglers do this, who were just mechanical junglers, and the mechanical junglers are in at the time. And people don't just go, oh, this guy's good. They're like, oh, forget all the old people. They're trash. This guy's the truth. And what they don't realise is, that guy obviously is at his best now. We've never seen him play the game before. So the fact that he's at his best now doesn't imply anything actually about what happens when the meta changes, what happens the next year, what happens if he's in a different team. Whereas actually the player who's proven quality, who's been through different metas, been through different teams, been really good for years, but is having like an okay split now, you can bank on him to come back in a way that you can't with the other player. Like what I always used to tell people, because oftentimes this would contrast their favourite player with mine. Like, if they want to contrast some player with, like, a classic player I like Thorin or Forgiven or something, say, let's see one of your players played as many years as mine has. Let's see where they're at then. I don't want to know where they're at the first 6 months or 1 year. That means fuck all, mate. Because what you're doing when you do that is what a ZWoo fan does, which is you go, well, look, my dude started the game better than anyone, and in 2 years he's been the number one player. It's like, you are aware, right? He could not even be the number one player tomorrow and never be it again. Spoiler, what's happened these last few months? Well, he's magically just not a god anymore, is he? He's just a good, really good player. And you see, even a small drop-off has had an enormous impact on both his individual results and his team results. So, to me, that's why you can never, ever take anything for granted in that scenario. I understand why people project forwards like that with trajectories, but it doesn't always work that way. Like, sometimes it's the opposite. You've actually seen the player peak early on, and you've got to see if they've got any more to their game.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And we don't really know as well, like Hobbit reinventing himself in a way where he's on this roster. He's got plenty of memories that he can draw back on. He's got plenty of experience. I don't necessarily doubt that Gambit are not equipped to improve, but I feel like people saying that they're fine, they're like almost like maybe they have an adaptation period or something. I feel like their issue as a roster is probably going to be more on the mental side. I guess they'll get a layup because we're probably going to studios with no crowd first before we go back to full LANs. So the pressures and the environment won't be as foreign as just playing online. But I do feel like if there is ever a point where this team gets a little mentally reset or something, you've seen that in their games now, even in the online era, where that can actually really throw a spanner in the works for them. That can really slow them down, break their momentum, and get to a point where they are a lot more chaotic and they're very slow tactical T side, where they obviously do try to lean into those more scripted defaults, I guess you could say, because it's not exactly like always a tactic every single time. That kind of stuff will break apart a lot more often when they are mentally not in the game, which is understandable, especially in these best of 5 finals and these long series or whatever that go into ridiculous overtimes. But that's something that a lot of the LAN tested teams just don't have to deal with when they get back to it. Their adaptation period will be remembering stuff. Gambit, for the most part, aside from Hobbit, just don't have anything to remember. And that's, I think, what their biggest hurdle is going to be when we get back into it.
Like, the problem is, it's all well and good telling players, which I've tried too many times. I've took many angles. You know, an obvious angle to tell a pro player right now would be look around the world. Go and ask small business owners how they're doing in some of these countries. Like, mate, you have a job. In fact, you get paid handsomely. Does that not motivate you to practice? The problem is it doesn't. Like, at the end of the day, if they did it for the money, well, they've got the money. If they do it for excellence, they already do it for excellence. If they were someone who just mailed it in and got paid a lot of money, then they're probably going to keep doing that anyway. You're not really going to actually, like, change how someone probably thinks about the game. So it's all well and good telling these players, like, just be good online. All we have is online. Like, if your entire life in Counter-Strike was going to LANs, playing on stage, trying to win the championship, like, you're just not going to be able to completely, like, 180 in your mind. And even more than that, I don't even know if it's even the right approach. Because to think about this, right? So you've probably seen stories come out where, like, an example would be Vitality, where Vitality, the reason why they were having all those people standing behind them when they played the finals at the end of last year was they wanted to create, like, a feeling of, like, being in a stage environment, as it were, you know, having more people watching and having the pressure of your boss watching while you're playing. So they were doing things which were trying to replicate LAN form. Now, here's how you know that no one's given an honest and, like, good faith discussion about this topic of online versus offline. Logically, we should all tell them that they're wrong to do that. Because why would you give yourself a disadvantage, which you have no reason to have when you're online, in an online game where your opponent might not be doing that? Logically, you actually have lowered your chances to win the match. So we should all be telling them they did the wrong thing, right? That's the problem. On the one hand, we want to congratulate all these orgs for not totally making it like a different game and trying to treat it as if it's LAN and waiting to go back to LAN any moment because they're trying to be responsible and think, what if we could have gone back to LAN in October or January or May now, for example. They're all planning as if it's going to be over and what the world will be like when we go back on LAN. But technically, if you wanted to win as many online games and just perform online, you should have just been exploiting everything. So, in my opinion, it's like there's no solution to the online period. People, quite frankly, the fans are constantly sending mixed messages about what they want during this period. I think realistically, we're all frustrated and it just is all bleeding into how everyone's debating about it. So unfortunately, what could be really interesting discussions become quite boring. Like for me, if I want to, here's the most interesting question you can ask based on the online era, is to say, forget the online component for a moment. Just the fact that it's been around a year means that in that period of time, even if we'd been on LAN, a team could have emerged who could be new top 10 team, a la ENCE, Furia. You think Vitality, you go back the last few years, you think of teams that did that. To me, that's the more interesting question, because then, now I have got someone, not even doing the online thing, now I'd have someone thinking of teams like Virtus Pro, Heroic, Big, these sorts of teams, and they'd now be trying to figure out, this guy already had this much LAN experience, or maybe this guy only needed 3 more tournaments, or this guy had already played in a minute. That's the more interesting one with me. I think that at least actually as a hypothetical could go somewhere. Just trying to say, who looks good online, but you think won't be good online, square brackets, it means you're saying he's a shit human being who's scared. Like that just gets too far into all like emotional stuff where I feel like people ruin the conversation, unfortunately. Not a lot of people can have like an adult discussion if you haven't noticed in esports. It just becomes barbershop shit, but like not the good part of barbershop shit, unfortunately. It's just people going, man, you a hater. You a hater. Why you hate him? And he's like, I can't do anything with that, man. I'm trying to have a discussion here, you know. Do we have a different topic to move to? Where are we going?
That being said, we'll call it Thorin's Law. Basically, there is no Twitter following without serious mental illness. In that respect, do you think CSGO is better or worse than the rest of the field as far as esports go? And that question goes to everybody.
I'd like to know what the people think on that one first, because obviously, like, I'm gonna have a unique perspective. So I'll see what you guys think in terms of your like pulse of the community, sense of it, etc. What would you guys guess? I don't know how many games you all follow, but just give us a sense.
I'll go first since it's my question. I grew up playing CS, so dealing with toxicity and taking crap from people, I figured was a point of initiation. So I got used to it. I don't think anybody that's on Twitter ever went through something like that in the sense of like, you know, keyboard warriors versus keyboard warriors. And I think the hardening of initiation to the CS community, if you actually assimilate, ends up for a higher percentage of stable people than Overwatch, just for an easy comparison.
I wouldn't mind chiming in. From my experience with the infamous League of Legends Reddit community, longtime lurker, never really posted. I want to draw some experience from real life. I worked at a powerlifting gym where a lot of world champion powerlifters came from for about 2 to 3 years. And in real life, when, you know, you can really tell when somebody's bantering you versus when they're like attacking something that you're doing or just trying to give input of like, hey, I saw you doing this thing. You weren't doing it quite correctly. If you try this might work better for you and you might grow, which in person, when you see somebody that's 230 pounds shredded as hell telling you that you did a lift incorrectly, it's really easy to go, oh yeah, I should consider that. I think a lot of times in the online community, people can't separate banter from harassment, and they get stuck in the weeds trying to determine, oh, was this person just like talking shit to like, you know, get something stirred, or were they directly attacking my character? Now, in the League of Legends community, it seems that a lot of times they're very soft, I guess, like you would say. And I think, you know, Richard Lewis would say the same about like the Valorant community right now. People are like really soft, and I don't know why that is per se. I think it's because like it's a bunch of young people, and like you were saying, maybe they haven't been initiated, but I don't even think there's an initiation. I think there needs to be almost like a critical thinking or like a stepping back of, okay, where's this person coming from? What are they trying to communicate? Where's their opinion? Like, you know, giving people benefit of the doubt is something that I don't see a lot online, but when you really do meet those people in discords or even in matchmaking, when you're like, wow, this person's like not shit for brains, and they know how to talk, and they know how to like coherently say what they're trying to do or what they want to do or how they're trying to grow. It's really, you know, I try to form my community around those type of peoples, and for the most part I have a good time because I don't spend my time on social media like Twitter. Like I check it here and there, but I'm not actively involved. But I think it's I don't know, it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, the problem is with giving people the benefit of the doubt is that it goes, I think, both ways, where not only do you have to give people that sort of human understanding element when you are just like reading comments in some thread that you're not connected to whatsoever, but if you're making your own content or building your own community and members of it or people who are commenting on it are serving up the same old shit that you've seen time and time again, it does just blend together. And there is that NPC factor that you really do have to work very, very hard to avoid. And at certain points, especially with how connected everything is, I feel like things just get very, very quickly like overwhelming if you bother trying to engage with it. That's why, like, as a bit of an aside, I think it's very impressive that Richard Lewis is able to seemingly respond to a significant portion, or at least a non-trivial portion, of the people that are like attacking him or calling him out. And he does give them the airtime, so to speak, on his Twitter platform. But like the fact that he is able to actually deal with that and still be as productive as he is, like that would already be a full-time job for most people, dealing with the like just responding to the people that he responds to on Twitter. So like I think once it gets to any sort of scale, just like with any other problem in the world, you can't fix the whole thing yourself. You can't really take on the whole responsibility there. And you have to almost just worry about your community, just worry about the people you cultivate, your family, your friends, that sort of thing, your close-knit corner of the world, as so to speak. And I think when people are so busy doing their own things and essentially being just self-actualized human beings, there's not going to be an opportunity for them to respond to any of this stuff anyway. They just won't have the time in the first place. So that probably also plays into why, like, basically you see the sense that maybe you've driven away, the community has driven away some of the people from ever interacting with places like Reddit. I remember, I think it was 2 years ago now, there was some sort of thread on something that Anders had tweeted out, and he was like instantaneously sort of just like what the fuck? Like, why has this happened? That's like just an example off the top of my head where like these people don't even like anytime they even attempt to try to engage, something bad will happen because something bad happens in that way almost every time, even when they don't engage, like when they're just doing their job as a broadcaster or something. So you almost have to turn up the signal, turn off the whole thing because of the signal noise ratio. And I think that probably jades a lot of the people who would otherwise be interested in responding, especially since if you think about it, to what Thorin said earlier about how like a player who is playing on an LEC team or something for 1 year, they're not really that, like, they're not genetically different from you in that sense. It's the same thing with content creators. Like we all started doing something from a very small amount and then we got to wherever we got to. And like there was a journey there. It's not like we just came out of the womb with a YouTube channel or whatever. So bearing that in mind too, at some point you are engaging with the feedback, or in theory you're at least thinking about it, even if you're not responding to it. And when it's manageable, that's fine. But when it gets to a point where at scale it is just too far up there, it's impossible to read every message, or not tenable for your health, I think that also contributes to it. And I think that part is universal regardless of esport. But I do think that there is something to what was voiced earlier about League of Legends specifically. And I think this also translates to Overwatch, and maybe even some of the, I think StarCraft 2 and stuff had some of these issues where basic banter, basic, like what would be called like bad banner stuff would essentially elicit a very disproportionate response, a very hostile response, instead of just being met with in kind or ignored. And those are two much more reasonable, I think, healthier, we'll say, alternatives to responding very vitriolically.
There's even actually a logic specifically in StarCraft as to why that mentality came along. Because I've told this story before that when I first came into StarCraft after not following RTS games for many years, I thought people were actually, I thought it was like a meme on Team Liquid, the website, when people were talking about like a player being really rude for not typing GG. I thought they were genuinely like, it was like a meta joke and they were like making fun of the idea of like, imagine how ridiculous it would be to actually be upset about this. But they weren't. They were actually genuinely, they considered it like a fucking affront that someone didn't type GG at the end of a game they lost, even though they were the loser of the fucking game, no matter how the game went. And what I realized was basically, because StarCraft specifically, we're talking about StarCraft Brood War here, was a massive game with obviously not literally just Koreans who live in Korea, but Asian, second generation Asians, immigrants to America. I think generally they took sort of the Korean/Asian Confucian culture of like honor and face. And the idea was you were supposed to be polite in all circumstances. And so to them, I mean, they're the sort of people, if you know them in America, like they're the ones whose parents are like the meme, like you have to get the A+ on every fucking exam, otherwise you failed. So their whole thing was like, they were coming from a very, very different place than a bunch of like slacker kids playing Quake or Counter-Strike who, you know, are going to be pretty free with their mouth and don't particularly give a fuck about an honor-based society. So I can even see for some of the games where it came from. League of Legends and Overwatch, it was obviously pushed by the dev as well, where they were trying to like imply they were sort of like crafting the sort of people that you were going to be. So that's just going to play into the people who are like the outrage mob, unfortunately. The problem with Counter-Strike is this. If we go back to, I'm going to say like, I'd say like 2016 was the year I noticed it started to change. Until about 2016, a lot of the stereotypes you'd assume about Counter-Strike did exist. Like, yeah, people generally were used to trash talking. Obviously, the game dev didn't really ban you or deal with it at all, so it was kind of accepted in the game. And as kind of people have outlined here, it was one of those, like, if you can't stand the heat, get the fuck out the kitchen. Like, you don't have a choice. Like, that's why I always give the analogy of, like, pick up basketball. You try going to some park where someone's playing a game and then telling those guys like, whoa, guys, what are we doing here? Like, we have to call the fouls properly, and you actually that wasn't a steal, you knocked my hand. Like, you're just gonna get fucking punched in the face, or you have to leave the park, aren't you? You have to, they set the rules, you have to play by them, or that's it. You don't have a choice to demand how the other 9 people in the game play. But unfortunately, like in games, the devs that have pushed that have sort of made that a mentality of the player, that he can just demand everyone else plays a certain way. Now, where it got different in Counter-Strike, which is a bit depressing, is it's a mixture of 2 factors as far as I can tell. One is that we just got, I know people always tried to make it sound like the new fans in esports were 14, but they weren't actually. Like, if you go back, I'm going to guess the esports fans, the average esports fan in like 2016 was probably like 19 years old or something, 20 years old. I'd say it's more like that sort of age. There was an influx around 2016 on. I don't know if it was these games like the Battle Royales and stuff, but man alive, the amount of 14-year-old kids that were never in esports who the next day had like the profile picture is the logo of the team, or something to do with the team's name in their actual fucking like Twitter name, or everything's just like standing for the team or the player they like. Like there was an overwhelming amount of those people came in the space. Obviously in CS it was because of teams like Optic, FaZe Clan moving into our game. They just brought with them loads of those morons. So that in itself, unfortunately, like did dilute the quality of discussion massively. Because like think of someone like anyone who's been on my Discord knows this. You get the notters where they are like a ZWoo fanboy, but at least like in doing so, they have interesting points. Like they're gonna know off the top of their head every stat about his career, or they're gonna know some detail you don't know from an obscure interview. Engaging with that guy, you might actually get some value out of it. Unfortunately, like that's actually now compared to the average person, that person's suddenly valuable, even though they might have been like a weirdo before. The average fan, there's not even anything to their comment. Like their comment is just like, oof, wow, yikes, this is aged well. Like there's nothing there. Like it may as well be a bot. It may as well just be a bot that spews one of 3 responses to whatever you say. And then the other one, and this might be a bit more subtle if you're just someone who's consumed online media and you haven't been sort of part of like seeing how followings work, etc., is basically, it's what I've said a few times on By the Numbers recently. Back in the day, the person who replies to my tweet is someone who follows me on Twitter. So even if they don't like me and they're a fan of the player I don't like, for example, they still to some degree care about my tweets, who I am as a person, and want to engage or hopefully be allowed to still follow me. That ain't the case at all now. The majority of times now that you get loads of responses and it's all just people going at you, they don't even follow you on Twitter. If you look at their account, oftentimes, if say I've dissed someone who's like an influencer in League of Legends, they might not even follow any of the games I follow. And this is the problem. Nowadays, esports Twitter has become like what political Twitter was even a few years ago, where it's not people who follow you commenting and engaging in good faith with your ideas. It's people who don't follow you, don't like you, and essentially you're the wrestling bad guy for them, and then they're just attacking you or spewing vitriol at you as a way to sort of vent some sort of frustration over an issue or something you've done or said or whatever. In that scenario, like, who would even want to engage with that? Like, who would ever want to have a discussion with someone where their mentality coming into it is, I don't even know you, I don't know anything about your work, I don't like you as far as I can tell, and I don't respect anything about your work, so now would you like to read my thoughts? Well, the answer's no to that. Like, that's not making an echo chamber, that's just actually setting the basic ground rules of what would be an interesting conversation for both parties. I'd even say as well, as you scale up the amount of people online, you also get people who just have horrific social skills. And as you pointed out in the first comment, there are no social cues online. So one of the saddest things ever is you get the scenarios where, like, you never have to worry about this in real life. Like in real life, let's say we were all at an esports event, right? And I was in some sort of a green room, or could even be a party, and I'm with a bunch of other people in esports, right? If I was talking to a famous woman in esports, at no point in time would a man walk up, not introduce himself, just say to the woman, you have nice breasts. I actually prefer Ariana Grande's breasts to yours, but yours are nice as well. Like, nobody would ever be so socially incompetent that they would ever put themselves in a situation to do that. But that's essentially what, like, just reading Twitter's like if you're a famous person now. It's just people making, like, mad, out of nowhere, non sequitur comments that are usually, like, mildly obnoxious. And you just read them, and if you're the person who's the person in question, you just think, why am I even opening this section? Like, it's just diminishing returns every time. Like, I'm getting, like, 2 comments that vaguely engage what I'm saying. So, basically, the signal noise has ruined it, unfortunately. And in that sense, Counter-Strike has gotten quite a lot like the other followings and fan bases. Like, the average fan now, if I look at all the esports games, seems fairly homogenous. It's some sort of like 14-year-old American kid who drinks way too many energy drinks that are full of sugar, has a terrible diet, had no actual like strong male presence in his life, like a role model. And as far as I can tell, it's just like basically them being on the internet or playing video games is like kids having a party when their parents are away for the weekend. Like, they're just misbehaving when they're out and about. It's the same, because the only scenario in real life I can compare what it's like to engage with randoms online is like if you've ever seen kids in America in a mall or in a movie theater or something who are like 14-year-old kids and there's no parent with them. In the modern day, they're mad out of control. Like, they'll just be saying rude things to people, they'll be shouting, they'll be trying to make noise, basically it's just antisocial behaviour, unfortunately. So it actually doesn't even really have anything to do with esports. It sort of ties to wider problems, really.
Can I go off that for a sec?
Sure. Go for it.
Wonderful. So that was something that I was trying to formulate for a week or two now, coming into this discussion, is the idea that maybe we've outgrown some of these communities that at first were small enough, like you're saying back in the day, you know, people that engage with you on Twitter were your followers, but now Twitter has reached this threshold where it's just chaos and it's, you know, like you said, there's diminishing returns, might as well be bot engagements. Now, I know in a few of your videos, you've mentioned stuff about old school Counter-Strike communities building up from, you know, different countries, and they would have different styles based on, you know, whatever country or whatever thing was developing there. Do you think that we could use that as a whole in terms of like a social arena where we are more segmented across different areas, kind of like your Discord, for example? Like everybody in this Discord is going to be of some sanity, and
you got to be
like
pre-selected, sort of. Yeah, exactly.
Right, exactly. So what do you think going forward the steps to like almost like you or like Richard Lewis would say, like picking up the pieces, like this is what we have to deal with now, is this overpopulated social media presence. Now, how do we pick up the pieces and find our community within that and be like, okay, this is the community. This is kind of what we expect of the people within this community to act or behave or whatever the case may be. Do you think that's a direction that we need to go? Or like what would you recommend? Or what is Thorin's idea of moving forward with the esports community, mainly maybe like Counter-Strike, you know?
Basically, we have to go back in time and curate the community. Whereas at the moment, the approach we were taking, you think about it, it's just by virtue of like the business model in esports is get as many raw viewers as possible, lowest common denominator approach, and then sell 10-cent widgets to them from some shithole company that's trying to sell 1 million things a year. Like that model, it creates the world we're in now. It's totally logical we'd end up where we are. The problem is, if you want to have interesting discussions, it's easy. You just have to use a different tech approach. Like, as we say, you have to have a Discord, and then you have to have mods that vigilantly monitor the Discord to make sure people aren't ruining conversations or being antisocial. Like in this scenario, basically, when that kid who's just lived in a basement for 20 years comes up and says to the girl, "You have nice breasts," my fucking Discord mod's the bouncer who just fucking picks him up like Jazzy Jeff in The Fresh Prince and yeets him out the fucking door, doesn't he? Like that, the conversation can then continue without that idiot. So unfortunately, we do have to go to smaller, curated conversations. It's why actually, if people don't know, the channel I'm doing with Monty, which basically will probably be one of my business interests in the future, where we're going to like make a company and pool some of our content potentially. Well, we've got a Discord, the Insight and Esports one. That's also going to try and be the same thing. We're going to try and have it where people can have real discussions back and forth, because we used to have these back in the day, believe it or not. Like the reason why people rave about TeamLiquid.net, it's not as great as people make out, by the way, but it's true. If you went there and you went into the threads from a match, you could have incredibly in-depth discussions about a game, about the meta, about the individual actions, with really intelligent people back and forth and to your heart's content. And yeah, the odd moron's going to make a comment, but the signal noise of morons was way lower. And actually part of it, by the way, was the fact that it was just a flat forum. Like, if I comment and I'm literally a champion in the game, and you comment and you're Billy Nobody who just made an account yesterday, the forum treats our comments the same. So now the quality of what we're saying has some sort of impact. It's not like Reddit, where the idea is I might make the best. We've all seen this. Someone makes a really interesting counterpoint on Reddit, and you don't see it because it's hidden, because it was downvoted by people who just don't agree. So, like, Reddit is almost like the way it actually works in practice ensures you won't get interesting conversations. Twitter pretty much ensures you won't. I mean, you'll never get past the power dynamic, unfortunately, no matter what fans think. Think about it, right? Logically, if I don't know you exist until the second you post a comment now, I'm not going into it going, well, give this guy a chance. Maybe he's an interesting person. I'm just seeing you. You've just existed for the first second. Your first comment's something inane or stupid. I'm probably just going to move on with my life. Like, to me, the person you know, we don't have a symmetrical relationship. We have a totally asymmetrical one. You know loads about me and what I like and what I think about. And presumably, if you're here, you fuck with it on some level. So you're coming into the conversation thinking, well, I'd like to get to this point. But it's like, unless your opening gambit's interesting, it's never going to happen, is it? Because what the person's not understanding is I don't know them. And they literally didn't exist for me until 1 second before. So if my first experience is some garbage, I'm just not even going to engage. So to me, it's to have like Discords, potentially, I would actually even like in the future, I want to do this if we can get this company angle going. I would even like to have a straight up text forum again. That's just well run, and that the aim is to have intellectual conversations. I can even tell you, by the way, this isn't just like something where I'm spinning my wheels with an idle thought. There are some top people in these games. Think of some of the people who are on my shows who like to talk about meta concepts. Some of those guys have even told me if there was a site like that again where it was probably cute, they'd join in. They'd love to have those conversations. It's just right now there isn't really a medium to do it, you know. Like people do it on their streams to some degree, but that's about it really. Aside from that, the conversations just don't happen unless it's like a talk show and I can sort of set it up, you know. But the idea of this would be to be more organic, of course. And crucially, it's not just people I select. It would be, you could sort of be pre-selected yourself by showing that you're worth on such a discussion place and build up your own personality or presence in the space, you know. I think it's definitely possible still. I will also say, by the way, the third factor, and this just goes without saying, is you have to charge. Even literally a $1 filter gets 99% of morons. So that really sort of says something about the internet as well, which is that somehow just charging someone even $1 makes them value well, it doesn't make them value it implies that they value it on a level that the guy who just does it for free doesn't. So I have to say, it's not a surprise to me that, like, I might have only ever had 3 people who are even patrons of mine who complain about ever being blocked on Twitter. I don't think the others even got blocked because the kind of person who pays to be a patron probably isn't typing stupid shit to me on Twitter, is he? You know? So I think it's possible. I haven't given up completely.
That's good to know, because obviously one of the highlights of the early internet for me when I the early like internet as it was being adopted in the early 90s and early 90s was, for me, the fact that I could just register on a forum or whatever and actually have a conversation with some people.
They were the shit, weren't they? Yeah.
Yeah.
If people don't know, that was actually the main way that Joe Rogan was famous on the internet. Before he did his podcast, he used to have a big, just classic bulletin board style forum. And it was a forum where, because he was a comedian, he had all these disparate interests, UFOs, fucking drugs, MMA, because he had all these crazy interests. Essentially, you could just talk about anything you wanted on that forum within reason. And so what you got was a whole bunch of weirdos who were the kind of people who'd like Joe Rogan, just talking about the latest stuff, suggesting stuff. And listen, not like every conversation wasn't some epic highbrow conversation, but like the average level of discourse was way better than what you'd get on Reddit or whatever, you know.
I think that the scale that esports has reached has forced interaction with fans from a social media aspect. Like, it's forced a lean towards making it the least offensive thing for the greatest group of people and kind of the most positive thing. And on the flip side of that, people on social media have to deal with the absolute worst things of basically some of the worst people in the scene. And it's like, now that it's so big, we need to go back to early internet and go back to those forums and stuff like that. There was a forum for everything, every car, every device, blah, blah, blah. And basically within that, you had like-minded people. It makes sense. I just don't know what that looks like in today's day and age, because it is like so wide-reaching.
It's why I say, to me, like, that's why you have to tie it to the business model of what you do. Like, obviously, I could do this in theory, just pro bono. Like, I could do this as a way to have a fun discussion on the side as well as my career. But if you want to convince other people to do it, the best way is always their self-interest, that you'll make more money doing this. If people haven't noticed, I generally don't believe in the old model. I think actually it's gone as far as it can in esports. And the fact that esports can't get over the hump and get more actual raw revenue just shows it doesn't work. This idea of like trying to sell to everyone in the world your product, that only works for people who are selling fucking baked beans and fizzy drinks and stuff. And even then you need massive marketing campaigns on their screens to brainwash them that they need this shit. If you actually want to make a community, in my opinion, you do it small. So the logic for me, it's like I've said on my shows recently, is you're looking for 1,000 people who actually will literally directly financially support you. That 1,000 is all you need. You can make your whole living off that. You can do everything you want to do off that. Instead, the current approach, like I say, is you try and get 200,000 people to occasionally once click on one thing you did. Like, that's not a great model to go towards this. That's going to keep you at the lowest common denominator angle for obvious reasons, just based on the scale, isn't it?
Yeah,
we got another topic.
Quickly.
Yeah, are we going anywhere else with this? Either someone else jump in or switch topics.
I'll just quickly say on the topic of the $1 entry fee or whatever, I think it's the implied value there that makes it so much of a difference, because like if you know that you like everybody's here for opting into paying a single dollar even, then you know that there's this agreed upon foundation for any conversation to take place. And that's the same reason why I liked forums so much, is because the implied value is you're spending the time. It's not really a dollar amount, it's a time amount. And you're spending the time to write out a larger post than what you can fit in a tweet or what most people will put in a Reddit comment. And because the expectation is that most people will be typing in more complete thoughts and contributing a larger just volume, I suppose, of ideas and content within their contributions to the forum, you don't get the same people who demand a TLDR from a long Reddit post or some shit, right? Like you get the people who are obviously there with an agreed upon like basis of how the conversation is going to go. And it doesn't surprise me that the $1 amount is actually that impactful, even though on its face, there's nothing to intuit that. But when you sit down to think about it, I think it makes a whole lot of sense.
I think even just the labor of having to go and add a credit card to your account is enough to keep a lot of people that would have otherwise just done useless trolling and forgot their account existed otherwise.
Yeah.
It's like a deadbolt for a thief. It's a deterrent, so they move on to the next easier thing to annoy.
Yeah, basically, like that's where actually I would agree with like how it works in principle, because I was obviously worried, like, look, it's only $1. Surely some morons is going to sign up for $1 and then troll us all for the fact that they paid. That never happens. Because as you're saying there, Eddie, basically, Zachary, basically what happens instead is the guy doesn't think, well, fuck it, it's only $1, I'll sign up. What he thinks is, why would I sign up for that? I can just troll these other people for free on Twitter or something, or on Reddit or whatever. So they never go down that avenue. It basically does, like, it filters out all the morons. Because there's just a million things for free to do on the internet. Like, you can go into a game and harass people, can't you? So that guy actually, believe it or not, doesn't ever just go past the $1 barrier, which is great for us. But you can also see why, unfortunately. So that essentially, it also plays back into the problem, which is the reason why they don't charge at the moment is you wouldn't get hundreds of thousands of people to pay right now. So that's why no one else uses that model. But that's also why I can do it, because I only have to be one man who has to have enough to support myself. I don't have to support however many fucking employees ESL has or something, do I? So they're sort of painted into a corner. I can actually reinvent my approach to doing business potentially.
Another thing with the $1 entry fee is that you don't get the ban evaders. How many times do you see the same people with new users and new
on Discord, loads, yeah, of course. Yeah.
On all free platforms.
Richard gets so many nutters like that, by the way. You wouldn't believe the people who, they just make new Twitter accounts every time he blocks them.
Yeah.
That takes at least like 10 minutes just to get the new with Gmail, then make the... Like, that's how you know that person. This is why whenever anyone tries to gaslight you, they're like, you guys just call everyone mentally ill. Now, we call people who, like, make 4 Twitter accounts in a row to message the same shit as mentally ill. If you don't think they're mentally ill, I'm going to go ahead and make a guess about maybe you and your perspective on life. What you think's reasonable, you know. We're not saying to the guy who goes, hello, Richard, I think today's a good day. We're not saying that guy's mentally ill, are we? That's just a fucking guy.
I mean,
no, somewhat related to this. I had to ask as like it is a kind of an aside, but it's related to all of the fallout that happened after like 2 weeks later, the Clicks Phillip videos started raining in for you guys. I had to ask if you, assuming you watched the first video at the very least, at the end, he has this like very tepid burn where he's trying to say like, oh, that would require me to watch you, to watch your content, to make these summaries or whatever, to condense your thoughts into a smaller span of time. I think if you're really charitable, you can say that that's just him being like he's like trying.
He was trying to banter in theory, but he was obviously salty while he was doing it. Let's be real. Like, you could see it was just dripping off that one. He was. His whole problem with all those videos is Richard nailed this to begin with. I know people won't get this right because this might sound strange, but in terms of like what a person is feeling but not saying, and what they mean as subtext by something they are saying, where the actual thing they said might not seem as extreme as that, you're just going to have to trust people who've worked 20 years as journalists interviewing people, that we just have a better read than the average person. I'm sorry, we just do. Like, it's not like, if you think in these interviews I've prepared every angle, no, I can read the person. I know where we're going. I have a sense for where you might go on this question, what might happen next. So basically, that first video, Richard nailed it 100%. The first video could be translated as, guys, I'm going to make this video now, but I'm not mad in any way. I'm just going to do everything I would do if I was mad. I'm not going to tell you to go and harass these people. I'm going to tell you to not go and harass. Like, it was like one of those things, like, man, how much obvious is this supposed to be? Like, you only need one level of guile up to see exactly what the guy's doing. It's transparent. So no, like, basically, I think on the surface, that's a perfect example of what he was doing. Because obviously there's like mad plausible deniability. You just say, I was just harmlessly bantering, you know, like the joke there is, you know, your shit, haha, so I don't watch your videos. Now, I will say, I didn't think it was great banter because, first of all, the banter implies that you do watch my videos, therefore you know that they're too long-winded and rambling. If you don't watch them, the banter doesn't work because how do you know you're right? And how would you condense them if you don't watch them? And then secondly, it turned out to be a self-own because I didn't know this because I've only probably watched 4 Clicks Flip videos in my life. But it turns out in a whole bunch of his videos, he actually directly references my content. So it's also a mad self-own, apparently, if you know the guy's history, which I didn't, unfortunately, at the time.
So, no, the other reason I brought that up is that it is obviously weak banter, but the problem with it is that, like, the implication, if you aren't a little charitable for his, like, for reading into it, is he was literally saying he once considered taking your entire content library and essentially just robbing you of your fucking work by condensing it and putting it up on his bigger YouTube channel. Which,
by the way,
like, that is fucking weird. That's not a thing to do, man.
That's, by the way, a classic like burn angle of people in the industry, is to say that to me, sometimes privately, by the way, to be like, Cross, you know, anyone could just make your videos, but shorter. I always tell them, go fucking ahead. What you waiting for? Because if people haven't noticed, like, these guys are morons. You know that famous line where you say, that's a feature, not a bug? Being a long, rambling thing with entertaining tangents and fucking analogies about sports and getting excitable about certain areas that you could just deliver in monotone. Isn't that my entire fucking appeal? Like, what you're saying there is like, you know, I could just make this classic Ford Mustang, but with like a modern suspension and all like safety features. Like, no one buys a fucking muscle car from the 70s for like your daft cunt. You buy it so that it feels like it's got no suspension, so that you have to feel like you're a fucking stunt car driver to go drift around a corner, so that it doesn't have all computer display. It feels like you're in the 1970s. Like, these people don't even get the premise of what they're saying. Like, what you're saying there is, I could just make a short version of your video without any of the entertaining guy talking. Yeah, no shit, everyone could. No one would watch. They're only watching for the fucking British guy shouting with the ginger beard. That's sort of a key feature of his content. That's kind of the way I crafted my content, boys. I didn't make it so someone else could just say the same words, did I? It has to be me. That's kind of how I did it.
The other underlying aspect that really makes this funny to me is that, like, if you had to pick 2 people in the CS content space to be so far apart, it would be you and him. Like, the way that you guys carry yourselves on a broadcast or on content is, like, obviously the styles are completely different. Like, one's long form, one's literally as condensed as possible, where he seems to go through his videos and edit down, like, shave off as many seconds as possible to deliver the most efficiently, like, canned kind of thing. And whereas obviously yours is very much contrary, plus just the personalities, the personas, like, it's completely different. So I just thought it was like a whack angle at all accounts. And the implication, if he is serious, if there is any element of seriousness to it, instead of just being a lazy attempt at banter, is really not looking too hot and doesn't seem like something a nice guy would say. That's all I'll say.
That's actually where he fucked up as well, by the way, is he never ever should have revealed that he actually was salty and all the shit he revealed at the end, basically, because that's the problem. Like you say, his whole brand is almost the antithesis of what our brands are, what me and Richard's brands are. Like, at the end of the day, right, if someone says, you know, Richard Lewis and Thorin trash talked someone, right, that can't possibly kill your opinion of Richard Lewis or Thorin, or you were never actually a fan of them in the first place. Like, that goes hand in hand with what we do. The problem he has is his brand is that he's just a nice guy, isn't he? So I don't know. For my money, it was so stupid to ever get embroiled with that, because he was actually, even though he thinks like he can't lose seemingly because he has more followers than us, you can only lose in that scenario. Because some people were going to agree with us. Some people weren't going to like the idea you were battling us. Some people weren't going to, especially if they actually agreed that you trash talked to. Some people weren't going to fuck with that, mate. That ain't your style. That ain't what people are there for. So that whole thing was just badly executed generally.
I just think it was...
There's a reason that saying exists, let sleeping dogs lie, you know.
Oh, yeah. It's like, he's saying, I'll take out all of the things that you use to weed out and foster the community you actually want to interact with, and then release my own thing. It just made no sense to me personally.
It's also, the problem with it is, right, it's not a great angle generally, because as I say, like, basically my entire style is to do things long form. It's just my approach. It's how I do shit. Like, I like the idea that there's more detail there. And if you want more detail, you keep listening. That is my entire approach. Like, I'm actively not trying to make bite-sized versions. In fact, the real irony is I have that fucking side channel where they make the short versions. It's got like 4K subscribers. So every daft cunt on Reddit who really was just someone who didn't have time and was being a little princess just asking for someone else to curate things exactly as they liked. Thorin, why don't you just make a clips channel with short clips versions? Yeah, I did it. I didn't know, so I never clicked it. Yeah, great, thanks. Awesome. This is why you don't listen to feedback from fans, by the way. Because usually the feedback is just what they specifically would like right now, whether it would appeal to anyone else at all. You know, there might be no connection. It's always whether everyone else wants to watch it or not.
That goes for most things. It's people don't understand what they're looking at and just assume things should be different. It doesn't make sense.
Do we have an esports topic you want to pivot to now, someone?
Yeah, I do.
Let's do it.
Unless anybody else has one they want to...
No, jump in now, mate.
Go for it.
All right, cool. I was running back in my notes here. One of the things that I've noticed in terms of styles of companies, Riot versus Valve, Valve seems to be kind of I'm tripping over words here, mate. But anarchy, you know, like they let the tournament organizers, they let the community, they kind of let them run things. They don't really have much of a show or much.
In Europe, we kind of say it's like a laissez-faire approach. You know, the idea is you just let other people do it. Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. That kind of libertarian aspect.
Yes,
exactly. Do you think that going forward in future esports that's the way to go about it? Because you've been very critical of the authoritarian way that Riot has been handling, one, League of Legends, and two, how they're promising to run Valorant with, you know, I just heard in this call the workshop thing, they're not going to allow custom maps. I think one of the things that is really interesting about Counter-Strike is seeing the different ways that people develop. And at least playing League for 10 years, there's been this long period of development in terms of matchmaking where the matchmaking is downstream of competitive, and if these competitive players can't like really min-max their skill, it really shows in the matchmaking and the play, in the, you know, the player sense. Like a gold today, if you went back maybe 5 years in League and you were gold today and you went back, you would probably be plat or maybe low diamond, because there's that like progress of the game growing and evolving and the different fundamentals of the game really shining through all the players. Do you think, like, I would like to hear more of your opinion on like things that Valve has done correctly and maybe things that you think Riot should change, even though we all know they're not gonna, but directions they could take to really develop, you know, the games they seem to care so much about, but really don't allow the players, you know, the room to develop like a Valve does with Counter-Strike.
I mean, the real problem with this topic generally is, like, you set it up fairly well there, but the real problem is most people would frame it inaccurately. They'd frame it like this. Either they don't like the way Riot does it now, or they want Riot to do it differently another way, right? But it's always the implication is the game dev must do something. You actually see it in CSGO. People want Valve to do X, Y, and Z. The real premise at the moment we have a game dev like Riot or Blizzard who proactively do things. And then, as we say, we have Valve who essentially don't do things and let other people do them. Now, those are in no way polar opposites. Like, if anything, Valve's sort of in the middle, and then the others are, like you say, they're like sort of authoritarian. They're essentially directly authoritarian, because what they're saying is, I have the IP rights, which is like saying I have the God-given right to rule, and therefore I'm going to rule with an iron fist because I have all the rights and you have none of the rights. Now, the problem I have is this. Without making it too overt, how this would obviously abstractly apply to politics in real life, in theory, I understand why people have actually a predilection towards authoritarian ways of thinking, because in theory, it's the reason why actually the literal biblical reality that a lot of people might not be aware of, which was the premise of the Bible in the New Testament, is that Jesus eventually becomes the king in heaven and is literally the king of the world. Jesus just is our new government, essentially. Now, in theory, that is a very appealing prospect, right? Because if he really was the most perfect, compassionate human ever, he'd be the best leader. And if he was the leader and had all the power, then he would set the world aright and none of the scumbags could do anything because they wouldn't have any power ultimately. He'd have ultimate jurisdiction and he would choose everything that happened in the world. The problem with that is that only works in the perfect possible situation where the leader has all the power, is the best possible person, and presumably doesn't act just in a matter of self self-interest. Now, unfortunately, when I look around the world, practically every person who's fucking things up is acting in their own self-interest on some level, or indirectly in their own self-interest, as in someone else is paying them to act in their self-interest, which in their own sense is a selfish act, but it's like doing it for someone else. So the problem is, if I have a choice between the original two, someone gets godlike powers or someone just doesn't do anything and other people can figure it out, I'll always choose the latter. It's just basically like theory versus practice, even though theoretically the ideal scenario for esports would be that one of these game devs who has the IP rights flexes that muscle everywhere it's appropriate, maybe sets the terms on if you can ban people or not. Because, for example, there's an example where a game dev could do something good. A game dev, in theory, could go to someone like ESL and say, actually, I'm going to have even more charitable unbannings than you do. So I would like you to reduce the amount of time that people are banned from your company if they get caught on your anti-cheat. They could do things like that if you think that's a positive. They could do all sorts of great things. The real problem is, in the modern day, almost every game dev in esports is going to go the Riot approach, because it's just they see basically, unfortunately, the esports side as like a marketing adjunct to the main game. So it's just a way that if you fuck up the esports scene in the right way, it might pump more people into spending money in the main game. It's going to be hard to get people not to take that temptation and sort of mess with the levers of control in that sense. You're very rarely ever going to get a Valve approach. And in my opinion, I think the only reason the Valve approach exists is because they didn't make Counter-Strike, and the scene already was beginning to form long before they actually were like doing anything vaguely proactive in the space. So they just have a track record that they don't have to do anything, and it just sort of takes care of itself. I don't know that you'll see many other game devs do that, unfortunately. So there's a million things we could ask Valve to do, or Riot for that matter, but I don't know that either's going to do it in the way the other one does, unfortunately.
But doesn't that mean that one, like you riding or dying with the company knowing what they're doing? If you want the game to succeed and you use the esports scene as an advert for the real game, then the Valve approach would make more sense.
That's because exactly the point.
Yeah.
That's why Riot is terrifying.
Yeah, but
I didn't want to interrupt you if you had more.
No. But the thing is, if you are Riot, why would you do this approach at all? Because you know that if you fuck up double up. While if Valve fucks up, they only fuck up once, like only for one thing. Or if the esports scene fucks up in CSGO, someone else will step in and take over and do it better. Hopefully, there's at least an option for that. But in Riot approach, there's no option for someone stepping in and doing the better, like a new version of it.
One of the problems, unfortunately, that you have if you're Riot is you're also playing a different game than Valve. Like, think about Counter-Strike. Realistically, Counter-Strike is a game of Europe and North America. The other regions are effectively borderline negligible. Their impact, their presence, their relevance, they just don't really impact the greater world, right? You can market and sort of craft a space without having to have a massive amount of input around just North Americans and Europeans. There's enough overlap there that certain things could appeal to both. If you're Riot Games, think about how huge the game is in Korea, China, Brazil, Turkey. Like, you see what I mean? Essentially, their game is played by the whole world. So as a result, when you talk about the average League of Legends player, that person might be 1 million miles away from anyone who would ever watch an esports game. It probably is, if I had to guess, a 13-year-old Chinese kid who has only ever played games in a LAN cafe, and the only other games he played is he's played League of Legends, and he's played, say, Crossfire, or you know, like one of those like ones where you're in like a fucking dungeon and you just kill a million creeps/monsters. Like, that's the kid actually that Riot essentially is trying to get to play League of Legends. So to market to that kid and to manipulate that kid using your algorithms and your skins and all that, you probably are in a totally different dimension to whatever the fuck Valve is doing. Because part of what I think makes the game work in CS is CS fans don't seem to have the same interests as League of Legends fans. They don't care that there's not a new map. They don't really care that much that the game stays fairly similar. As far as I can tell, the pro scene sort of does drive a lot of the interest in CS. It sort of keeps you hooked in the game, even if you don't play it as much casually. As far as I can tell in League, most of the people who play casually have not very much connection to esports, as far as I can tell.
I think the way that Riot handles their game, they are constantly trying to preserve the image that they created for their competitive scene, their game, their culture. Valve doesn't have an image to protect because they did not create the vision of CS that we have today. So they leave it to us, the unfortunately much better equipped to make decisions for the way the game needs to be handled, to kind of guide it. Whereas Riot is just, the hand is not invisible.
Does anyone else have anything on this topic, or should we swap?
I think just in general, Riot's approach is, if you actually keep track of it, which nobody does, which is part of the reason why they're successful, it is very confused. I did jokingly reference the toxicity will increase when we add sandbox mode, because that will be an expectation for people or whatever. That was obviously years and years ago in League of Legends. And eventually they just did it like very shortly thereafter, actually. So they're very much like a reactive company. And it is, as we've, I think, touched on a few times in this very series, the issue with Riot is that they only really care to respond to outside exterior demands if there's enough of a sort of mob mentality behind it, or mob energy.
I suspect that they genuinely, like, essentially are using like a public focus group type approach.
Yeah.
Where what we're saying is like, yeah, like, so put it this way, they weren't wrong. Like, think about it, right? To people who are hardcore esports aficionados like you or I, we might cry all day that having replays is really important, right? Well, actually, we were wrong. Riot Games was totally right. They were able to go something mental like 10 years without proper working replay system. And it hasn't affected at all the esports side of the game. It's still incredibly popular. So in that sense, by the way, we're actually wrong. Now, not entirely. Like, to us, it's very important. And so that has actually, you know, had a noticeable impact on my enjoyment of the esports side of the game. But I'm actually wrong in the sense that Riot knows the random 13-year-old Chinese kid better than I have an understanding of an overlap of what me and him would share as what we want from the game dev, you know.
It's not too dissimilar to political polling. Like, policy decided on who agrees with the most, basically, the most people agreeing with it. It makes a, on its face, acceptable thing, but under it, there's no actual drive.
Put it this way, without risking the potential that this video gets fucked just by current circumstances, I'll mask what I'm about to say in a very obvious way, but you'll be able to figure out what the premise of it is. Think of how many things you hear in the news that are very alarming at first. Some sort of a massive restriction is going to be put in place. And everyone on social media for the first 2 or 3 days that the story comes out goes, oh my God, can you believe this? They're taking away our rights. And how many times does that thing never actually come to pass? And that's not because the people in power couldn't put it in. It's because they've essentially used us all as a focus group, and they've seen either certain numbers or certain demographics or certain key types of people don't fuck with the idea, and in fact might be actively against it. So what they cleverly do is either they say, right, we've got to take a different route to get there. We sort of maybe take multiple steps, it takes longer, or we just trash that idea whatsoever. In fact, usually they even come out and lie, like Riot loves to, and go, we were never really going to do that idea, of course, guys. We hear your feedback, and you do that approach, but realistically, you're just testing the waters. You were just seeing, would people react to that, or would they accept it? If they accept it, maybe you even plan to go further. If they don't accept it, maybe you scale way back. I think the game devs just do that, and Riot in particular looked to me like they always did that. That looked like what Reddit was. That like cynical shit where the person with the Riot on their name would comment in a thread and see if they could turn the thread back around. That just looked so... I don't believe they did that because they think they're cool guys and they wanted to interact with the community. Like, they were trying to really test, like, is this something we actually have to deal with, or can we just kind of put this out as a minor online stirring and it'll be fine on Monday, you know?
It's just planting seeds and seeing what grows. That's it.
I think you're being a bit generous. I think they just do their idiotic shit and it's like, oh shit, the Reddit is blowing up. Let's backtrack. Let's do something else. I don't think it's planned at all.
Calculated.
I think it's a bit of both.
But defending, since no one's defending, right? I'll give it a go. Since my MBA forces me to think like a business person. For some reason, the teams do like the approach and are flocking to Valorant for no reason. And even that interview you did with, I think it was the guy that managed Gen G or something like that, one of these North American orgs. And he was like, no, Riot is great because, we have this league. It has worked before in league, so it's actually safe investment, etc., etc. So somehow it is convincing these business people that it is a good way to approach esports.
Yeah, that's actually one thing that people might miss as well. I found this during the whole Flashpoint experience. Like, everyone loves to do this thing, right, where they go, hey guys, let's cut all the corporate talk and just talk face to face, right? That's not appropriate if you are actually people who work for corporations and you are doing a business deal. So what happens is a lot of people who just don't have aptitude at speaking that type of corporate speak try to cut through it all and think they're going to reach those guys. Well, when you talk to the people who own teams like Gen G, they just are mainly the people who are from the business world. It's rare that they are someone like fucking Hastro or Carlos that come from esports. So if they don't come from esports, the reason why the guy who gets their money is Nicola Nyholm is because he knows how to talk to those guys. He understands basically their parlance. You have to understand business speak may as well be like legalese. The words are in English, but it isn't the English language. And what you're inferring and referencing when you say certain things is sending a very different message than the literal meaning of the words. So I will say game devs are in the same boat as well. Like once you get to that level, you would have a way better chance of convincing them to do something differently if you came in with a bunch of focus group stats or some sort of corporate angle as to how it worked in another business than you would putting me on the call and having me explain a bunch of what might be common sense or historical context answers to Riot. Like the former would be way more successful than I would be in that case. Which kind of it shows why people like me unfortunately do not have our hands on the levers of power, as it were.
On the flip side, you've got organizations that then basically try to be the most appealing social media person and then just end up sounding like they're patronizing their audience instead of like in good faith trying to engage with them. Like recently, Team Liquid 0-2 to Dignitas, and then the Team Liquid Twitter saying, does that mean that we don't win the showdown? That pissed me off. Like, you're not taking it seriously. That was not a good result. I understand that you're trying to meme, but I mean, maybe a moment of silence would have been more appropriate.
That's also, though, where, like, esports, another thing that has fucked it as a business is, like I've told you with the Flashpoint orgs, they're all just followers. So I'll give you an example. This is a real case. I could even give the specifics. I told ESL and Blast and other tournament organisers to do so many of the things I did on Flashpoint. They did none of them. Then once I did them on Flashpoint, they just instantly copied them for their broadcast. By the way, I'm not making this angle like, wow, they copied. No, they should. I want them to do those things to make the broadcast better. But they, as far as they were concerned, I was just a guy whose job was to talk on camera. I wasn't there to give them input or give them ideas. I don't know anything about their world they imagine. Therefore, they never even considered my ideas. But the second they saw them work on a real broadcast elsewhere, they saw the efficacy of what I was doing and they just adopted it instantly. That's unfortunately what a lot of these people are like. They're just followers. Like, they aren't having an original thought. They're just seeing what do other people do. So the sad thing is, what you're talking about right now, the reason why that's a turn-off is because that isn't Team Liquid's brand, is it? Team Liquid isn't G2 Esports. They're not the team that trash talks and does edgy things and plays into meme. That's not their whole branding. So when you do that, you not only become a shit version of G2, but you also, by the way, put off people who support your team because you're not G2. Like, only so many... You've seen the same thing with CSGO analysts. How many times have you seen a CSGO analyst try and do, like, an edgy Thorin-type comment? And you just think, like, bro, why? Like, the best example ever was obviously Dust. It's like, Dust, that ain't your swag, mate. Like, it doesn't even make sense for you to go into that, like, wade into that swamp. That isn't your skill set. Like, people who like you don't like that, and you're only going to sort of enrage people because that isn't your shit. So to me, I do think that, like, everyone doesn't have to be super duper serious. We don't have to treat this like it's fucking the NFL, like, oh my God, this is America's game. Like, we don't have to go ham with it. But I do think each brand should have their own identity. I think, by the way, things like social media approach, you should sort of go into it knowing where your guidelines are at. Like, this is generally how I want to present it. This is how much fun I want to have. This is when I want to be serious. These are the sorts of things that you could do light-hearted memes around. These things, I want you to stay away from that. At the moment, all they all do is just hire someone who has, like, vague meme ability on Twitter, and they all just do the same approach now. It's just a shit version of G2. Even when it's the orgs, some of them are ridiculous, because I can't believe TSM tries to do the G2 approach. It's like, everyone knows you've got to stick up your ass and that you're not taking this on the chin, Reggie, and that you're really upset when you do this tweet, mate. Like, no one's believing that this is a fun tweet from you when you try and banter, you know. It just doesn't pass water.
If I see anybody from Team Liquid doing a hot tub stream the way that Ocelot did, like, no, you can't replicate that. that was genuinely entertaining coming out of G2. But I agree they should all have their own identity, but don't be just a shell of the most popular meme. I think the best probably execution is E-League's memes through the years, and whoever, I couldn't remember if it was like the position was VP of memes for ESL. Like there was some good stuff that came out of that. It was well thought out. It was not low bar. It was, you know, intellectual humor for the most part.
I think the other aspect to this too is that you talk about like an industry of followers as opposed to like anybody who's going to be a thought leader. That actually perfectly explains why they always pivot to whatever innovation has actually had success, and then they get stuck doing that and it doesn't suit them because they didn't have the vision to come up with something novel that would actually be innovative in the space. And they certainly are not going to have the vision to figure out how to take somebody else's idea and properly retrofit it to work with whatever they are existing in, as far as what their character is or what their brand or identity is or anything like that. So I guess it doesn't really surprise me that like the trajectory of brands like Team Liquid, where they have gotten a lot more chatty and casual and aloof. I don't see how it makes the brand relatable anyway, if that's even what they're going for. So I think it's perfectly valid to criticize that kind of stuff. But yeah, it is just a hollow shell of what the people who developed that brand or that style of humor and of sort of, they were a lot more like, there's almost like a watershed moment in a small kind of way. That's probably too big language for it. But when G2 started to actually lean into that very heavily, especially with their League of Legends division. And now the fact that like even their CSGO division is starting to get up into that with the players having a bit of personality on Twitter and stuff, that fits that brand, that org a lot better than like insert random pro from some of these other North American orgs or whatever. Like, especially it just feels very walking on eggshells. Like it's like a censored or redacted version of something that was actually good. It's the best way that I can come up with to describe it, because they don't want to go as hard as G2 does. They don't want to, like, they want to copy without any of the risk, essentially.
I feel like
you also just can't fake the funk with that, mate. Like, if you actually aren't a funny person who enjoys banter, as the aforementioned Clicks Phillip debacle shows, you won't pull it off. Like, I told Carlos this, I've mentioned it on my show, so I'll say it here as well. I straight up told him privately, you know, you're going to have to be a miracle worker if you think you're going to make Nico and Reckless fucking banter merchants, mate. And he was trying to tell me, like, no, don't worry, I'll get to them. Like, I've told them you have to do it to be in the team. All I'll say is this, any of you that have watched either game, did you ever see any? I didn't. They maybe did like one tweet or like, you know, appeared in a video for 5 seconds, but like none of them ever actually embraced the mentality. Like, because here's the thing, to do so would be literally, it would basically be anathema to the personality that these guys have, which is why they aren't into stuff like banter. Like for Nico to have the self-awareness to actually do a funny tweet like, I took Kenny S's job, maybe I'll take Nex's job next. Like, that would actually be funny, but to do so would require self-awareness of what he was like in his career. Therefore, he'll never get to that point. Same with Reckless. Like, he's not going to make a joke like, oh, well, guys, guess I need even better solo laners when he loses. Like, he doesn't get the joke in that sense. So, realistically, it's not even worth having people like that fake it, in my opinion. You only make an org around banter if you have the people who are good at that shit. It's the other way around. You don't cynically sit down and create it. Like, Carlos didn't do that. He did that because that is the shit he was into, and he thought that was funny, so he leaned into it. And then, from that, he managed to get it to a place that it worked, but, you know, he didn't know it was going to work this way when he started it, for sure. Right, maybe let's do one last topic. So, does anyone who hasn't had many so far want to pipe up with the last topic? This video was kindly supported by Eddie, Lager15, Pronogo, Shenlong, Zachary Carter, Alexander Rao, Andreas Kroknes, Animosity, Dean Tanglis, ErikHillestad, Hades, Jdubs, Jensen Goh, Kovacevicd, Tobias Bernasconi, Zoomba, Zyrathenia, and as always, special thanks to my dude, Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest? Would you like to ask a question in one of those monthly AMA videos I do? Do you want teasers on who the upcoming guests are? Or maybe you want to take part in a discussion about esports with moi? Well, put your money where your mouth is. Join the Skrilluminati today via the Patreon link in the description box below.